All right. Welcome back. You can say welcome back now when it's the second episode, Isn't that cool? To our podcast that still doesn't exist, but it will exist before too long. We're not far from when the day will come. My name is Will Chernoff, and with me is Carson Tworo. Carson, how are you doing?
I'm doing very well. I'm happy to be here. How are you?
Yeah, right on. Yeah, I feel good. Episode 1 was a lot of fun. We're in a rhythm here because we're just running it back the next week in this kind of pre-pod period that we're doing. So I'm enjoying that. I think this is going to be really cool when it's a live run of every week or so. And then we can kind of talk about things as they happen because I overthink that so much at Rhythm Changes and about when I post on social media, maybe, which we're going to talk about. Yeah. But this will just be a fun way to chat and keep up with what's going on. I look forward to that.
Yeah, it's great to have kind of a weekly standing check-in on some stuff and know what we're going to be thinking about and talking about. It's great.
Yeah. It's funny because we did episode 1 about the iPod series and digging the greats and listening to music. And I've been thinking about that lately because I've had a run of good luck in terms of music listening just in the week since we last spoke. I fired off a recommendation to you, in fact, in that time. And I've done that a few times here, and I've just kind of worked my way through some albums that I knew I wanted to get to. So it was funny. I don't know what the cause and effect is there, but maybe that encouraged me to do it,
Absolutely. Our conversation encouraged me to go back to one thing I didn't talk about last episode is one of my takeaways from that series, as well as the Filter World book that he talks about, authored by Kyle Chayka, was to start writing down what you are being recommended and kind of making lists for yourself of things you're seeing, things you're checking out. That's more of a Kyle Chayka thing. And I prompted me to go back to my list of movies I said I was interested in watching and albums people have recommended me, the recommendation that you sent over to me, and start to maintain that garden of future content to check out. As much as I don't like that word content, but that's, kind of what it is. It's books, articles, albums, things that I told myself I would check out. And I went back to that and pruned a little bit and added some things.
Yeah, I wanted to get through checking out a bunch of albums that I knew were going to be really good, but that I hadn't gotten around to. Just new releases of 2025. And I already had done some of the legwork on that. I have a sheet of new music releases that is non-Rhythm Changes, because I have my Rhythm Changes kind of editorial working sheet where I've put in things that I might cover. But this is global albums or big albums and whatnot that I wanted to check out. So I already had this sheet going. It did need an update, but I already had several albums on it. And so when I was thinking about that stuff, I just tried to keep that in front of me a little bit more this week, where I would make sure I had it as an open tab when I was working on something. And, just by doing that, this because currently we are both just working from home full time. So we have a lot of hours to potentially fill with music listening. So fortunately I took advantage of that, right?
That's awesome. I am, for whatever reason at my job, I don't listen to music when I'm working, almost ever. And it's maybe that it's just a different type of brain activity for me where I'll distract myself with music. If I have my job is kind of vaguely a coding technical job. And so I find myself, if the music's too good or, not ambient enough, I'll get carried away and start DJing for myself or whatever. So I'm envious that you can listen to music while you work. Occasionally, if I'm doing kind of a very menial task, filling out a spreadsheet or something, I'll get to listen to a record.
Well, I do a lot of menial tasks, let me tell you. So no problem filling that time with all types of music. So that works out good for me, I guess.
Yeah, love that.
Yeah. All right, we've got a double header today. I want to talk to you about what was the most read article on my website of 2024, titled Big Things Coming, Recovering from the Pressure to Create. You published this at Rhythm Changes. You actually alluded to it in episode 1 here last week where you were talking about, oh, I've been thinking about all this stuff and I started writing it. You started assembling this. You put it together. We ended up publishing it together, but this is something that you'd been chipping away at as your thinking on the subject for some time. We ended up getting it out just about a year ago now in April of 2024.
Yeah.
And I have a lot of thoughts about that. Other people chimed in. It was widely shared among our community, more so than even a lot of the pieces that were about artists and events and albums themselves. So it resonated in the Rhythm Changes community, and it was related to a lot of what we talked about last week, and it will continue to be relevant to what we talk about in the future. So just off the top of your head, that article, we're a year out. Where are you now versus the desire that led you to spend so much time writing it?
Good question. I also didn't know it was the most read article from last year on the site. That's very cool. This one actually, so the article I was talking about related to like the Spotify, iPod things, that's a separate, although related. I believe this kind of spun out of thinking about my Spotify listening habits. This one I started writing just a couple months before it came out, I think probably January of 2024, where I was in this space where I hadn't written a lot of music recently. I was in a bit of a creative rut. I wasn't drumming a lot. And I was sort of thinking about like, well, I should just get doing that because that's what I do. And every time I kind of sat down to write some music or do something creative, I caught myself framing it in the context of a post. I would sometimes on my Instagram page, I'd post myself making beats or whatever, and little snippets of things. And I caught myself sitting down and kind of getting bogged down by writing some music and going like, this isn't going to perform well. And I thankfully, mentally caught myself doing that. And I went, well, that's maybe a silly and unproductive way to think about working on music, and kind of examined that impulse, thought about how, in particular, I think Instagram in the music world, but I think it probably relates to like people on like Twitter or X or Blue Sky would probably feel that way if they were writers. And I think that social media platforms or general Web 2 platforms have kind of inserted themselves into artistic life so that it feels like you need to be doing this if you want to be a professional. Which, when I examined that, I thought that maybe actually isn't really the case, and wanted to kind of write a mini manifesto for my fellow artists who are feeling the same strain and the same pressure.
Yeah, absolutely. Because one of the first things that you posit in the piece is this question that you write early on: has artistic life become so consumed by and intertwined with social platforms that you're required to engage with them, which is what you were just talking about. And then by the time you get to the end, you're emphasizing that you want to push back against the imposition of being a creator and whatever baggage that comes with, just to be able to do your thing, and that there's all kinds of ways to do your thing.
Right.
And there's a thesis kind of that's also early on that I wanted to bring verbatim here because it's good. It's on that thread of thinking where you said, extended use and dependency on these platforms is counter to art making, and we'd be better served by stepping back from our newfound side gig as content creators. And that speaks to the crisis that you were in personally, because you were not engaging with it the way that you wanted to, and then you looked at why, and then there's this super pervasive thing that you were getting affected by and that you wanted to call out.
Definitely. Yeah. And maybe to the point that the first point that you brought up about like the call out that I was making, that like, is this so intertwined with artistic life that you just have to do it, right? That still is really, I think, kind of a rallying cry of, not rallying cry, a mutual collective bemoaning in the artistic community of like, well, we all hate doing this, but like it always came with a shrug. But you got to do it, you know. But you need to do it if you want people to come to your gigs or if you want your music to be heard. And I think, you know, we'll maybe talk about in the meat of the article, I'll talk about how that's like not really the case, right? There's like plenty of counter evidence that like this stuff isn't really helping maybe as much as it once did earlier in the decade. The comparison I made, I might have talked about this on the Rhythm Changes podcast at some point when we were talking to Chris.
With Chris, yeah.
Where I said like it began to feel the refrain of, well, you have to do it, kind of felt like hearing marketing said back to you by the subjects of the marketing. It'd be like someone saying like, oh, I feel sick from eating so much McDonald's, but I'm loving it. That it felt like, because that's Meta saying, oh, you have to do it, right? Like and so hearing the people who are having a bad time using Meta products saying like, well, you know what they say, you have to do it. It's like, who says? Meta says. And now all of us, but like really let's examine where we got that information from.
Yeah. I remember you did talk about the article when you spoke with Chris as well. And he himself also wrote at length on this subject, and I'll link to that too. I didn't think about that until now in terms of what we're going to talk about today, but of course that is the case. And his piece came out at a similar time as yours. He published it on his own Substack that he put stuff on infrequently, but you know, we both took notice of that. Can't remember actually whether it was before or after you, but there was a simpatico thing there for sure.
Yeah, by a couple of weeks, I think he posted before me.
Yeah. Did I come to you after that? And I was like, okay, now we got to get it done. Or like,
I think so. I think we were just like, well, now there's a conversation happening. You know, it was one of those things. I had said, oh, do we have to just not publish? Chris said much of what I was going to say in a different way, maybe more focused on his own experience and maybe his use of the platform. But I think we were like, oh, no, it still feels relevant and important, slightly different audience.
Yeah. I mean, we've noticed so many things in terms of examples of artists. I do kind of want to put names and faces to things to some extent, you know, that were written about in there, because I think that might be fun. But I could throw in one of mine first, and then we can get my examples off the table, because I don't think they're right on the button of what we're talking about. But there is a specific reason why I still engage with Instagram as much as I do, and if I could find a solution to this, then I would truly depart. Like I wouldn't have that much keeping me there if I could solve this one thing. And it's the same thing that I tell people about when they ask me, how do you do the gig list?
Right.
And I talk about how there's a portion of it that comes from just gathering publicly available things, and there's a portion of it where you have to solicit information in advance so that you have it for the month when you want to start a month with a full slate of stuff. But then there's the magic other portion that you can only find these relevant local music events by knowing who to follow. And I know who to follow, and I have for years, and so I get to see that stuff as it comes, as people post it. And this is where these people post that stuff, and I don't have a way around that. So I realized that there is a value there. There's like an alpha to me using it, that it would be very silly if I just turned away from. And I already do turn away from Facebook 99% of the time.
Right.
And I know I miss out on some things because of that. But I determined that that's a trade that I'm happy to make, because I don't think what I'm missing out on by not using Facebook very much outweighs the personal satisfaction I get from not using it. However, on Instagram, that's not the case. If I were to stop using it, the downsides of me not being able to grab that information and put it on the gig list would be larger than the relief I would get from not having to use it. So that is my main struggle with it, you know?
Yeah, and I think, I mean, to like take the whole ethos of the Big Things Coming article, I don't think that falls outside of it, right? Like, I think that's a perfectly clear-eyed way of looking at social media usage, of like, you have a good understanding of what you get out of it. you have a good understanding of like how to use it in a way that's not going to like make you feel terrible, and you are not relying on it to make your career, or you don't feel like you're relying on it to make your career. Um, and in fact, like I know that Rhythm Changes sometimes, has some meta ad spend, and even that is in line with the ethos of the big things coming. What I'm cautioning against is people who, again, this probably happens even less now than when I wrote it. I think it is actually beginning to fall apart, or the scales are falling from folks' eyes a little bit. But people who, independent musician starting out, building their career, thinking, well, I just have to post every day and, get my stuff shared as widely as possible. And then someone will find me, I'll be discovered, and I'll make a career. And that's maybe happening more on TikTok than it is on Instagram these days. But like, I still don't think that's a way to build a career, right? And it's like you're not deluding yourself by using the platform in the ways that you are.
Yeah, and I think we've graduated past the point where we need to discuss the platforms separately in terms of what they're for, because they have become for such the same thing.
Yeah.
Like you can talk about hereditary characteristics of the platforms, like which kinds of people or demographics are most likely to use them. And like, yeah, we spend more time with the Instagram cohort, and maybe the TikTok cohort is close to us too, even though we don't personally use it. But like, if you're just talking today about what are you going to do on any given platform, it doesn't matter so much the platform, because you're going to basically try and do the same thing. It's all kind of homogenized, right? So that's interesting. That's a new side of it that wasn't the case a few years ago.
Yeah, definitely. I think they've all kind of blended together a little bit in one of these ways where it's about we talked about that, like push and pull internet, right, in the last episode, where there's platforms used to kind of have host content, then you had to grab yourself. And basically every social platform now has moved to a push model, where they will push content at you, and you as the consumer and as a creator get very little input into what gets pushed, right? So like, it used to be the case that if you had 400 Instagram followers and you made an Instagram post, some like large percentage of that 400 followers was going to see the post. And that's no longer the case, right? Instagram's not interested in risking, similar how Spotify is not interested in risking you pushing pause on something that you either didn't like or you liked so much that you turn off your phone for a while. Instagram's not interested in, showing someone a picture of your breakfast that puts them off of using the app for the next hour or something, right? Instagram knows what will keep people engaged, and it's probably not your stuff, and it's probably not, promo for your next gig. And so that has certainly changed, and that's the case on every platform now. It's very difficult to engage with an audience.
Yeah, absolutely. The structural force, that's what it is, because on one hand, the supply of content is so vast and ever increasing, and also to some extent it's a deliberate platform decision to optimize for a certain goal. You could weigh how much you believe one of those things is more important, but they're both there indisputably to some extent. Yeah.
And I mean, you and I have talked about this beforehand, maybe after I published this article, where kind of the other piece of this issue that I think people don't think about enough, even if they're successful, right? So if someone does build a following, that when you're using one of these platforms and you spend your time building up, you do not own the relationship to the people who are following your work. And what I mean by that is, like, you are solely reliant on that platform to keep serving your content to those users. So that can change without you knowing. And you're dependent on that platform not deplatforming you for some reason. Maybe you get a copyright strike for talking about a song or like playing a cover or something. And, you are completely beholden to that platform to convert any of those followers or any of that following into an income stream, right? If that's like people who want to listen to your music on a streaming service or buy it on Bandcamp or come to your shows, you don't own the relationship with your followers. And that should be, if you're an entrepreneur, like a solo artist, that should concern you.
Yeah, absolutely. Even though it doesn't come up and people think about, email is obviously the alternative. It's the most accessible alternative, and it's something that artists understand. They don't really think about it. Push coming to shove on like email versus followers, it doesn't
Right.
come up. Like it doesn't matter until you're kind of until the chips are down and you're trying to get people out to something, and then maybe you kind of think about it. But you don't really think about it day to day. But yeah, it's important, and there are some artists we know who put effort into email to try and alleviate that, but not very many. And then it's kind of a it has its own kind of quirks and problems. Like, what do you do with email as an
Yeah.
artist? Like, what kind of content do you make there for it to be not only palatable for the people who are receiving it from you, but I think for most artists it's just like you making it. Like, how do you
Yes.
want to make it enough? How does it not become like a vegetables style thing that you dread doing? You know, I think that's a lot
Yeah.
of artists' relationship with email. And then it's unfortunate because if you're trying to reach your followers and you're encountering this well diagnosed issue of not having organic reach anymore, then you're
Yeah.
going to think about it. But at that point, you're in it, and it's like a tree that you would have wished you had planted years ago, right?
Yeah, I think there's like not a ton of easy solutions to this problem. I think it's really interesting to think about like futuristic ideas of this, because yeah, this, the existing solution is like start a Substack. Anecdotally, so my father's a visual artist. He's a painter, with quite a large Instagram following at this point, in the tens of thousands of followers. And he's kind of noticed that sometimes his posts don't perform as well as they once did, and that's just completely out of his control. And he has once had a consultant tell him, well, you should start a Substack, right? Then you own the relationship. People will sign up for your mailing list. And he's in this position of like making a Substack for paintings, where he's having to email photos of paintings to people, which is maybe nice, and people like to see paintings in their inbox. It's not really an ideal medium for him as like a creator. It's not what he likes to do, is sit down and draft an email with like 3 new paintings. It's not really the way people are expecting to engage with visual art. And so I think he's encountering that, like, well, how do you start owning an audience once you recognize the problem is there? And I think like one of the things that will probably keep coming up as we talk through the course of this podcast and develop our theory of everything as it pertains to maybe the arts biz or the music biz is, one of my hills that I'm going to die on is people need to get more technical. We didn't have time to talk about it in the iPod series, but the end of it, it's him realizing he has to like DIY make his own iPod, like, take it apart, put a hard drive in it, jailbreak it, get very like hacky and technical to make something that's going to work for him so that he can opt out of the platform economy. And in the future, owning your own network, owning the people that care about you, is going to mean probably maintaining a Discord server of your fans, right? I mean, that happens already with podcasts a lot. I know that. In the future, we're probably going to see a lot more like federated social networks, right? Decentralized social networks that aren't dependent on one platform. There are social networks that are built on protocols, right? Like the Fediverse, we're talking like Mastodon and Blue Sky. And you could conceivably see ways that, an artist that's, big enough could put together their own, the Taylor Swiftiverse, and Taylor could like have someone hosting a platform. This is outlandish. But we have to start
This is
thinking
for
about
the most big enough. Yeah.
Well, that's maybe the only example where I think it'd be practical to like host a Mastodon server just for their fans. But like, really, I think creators have to start thinking about like, what's the next thing? What's like a post platform thing that's not just Substack, because Substack's got its own issues, or, Ghost. It's a lot of effort to maintain. And it's not, that format doesn't work for every medium and every fan base.
Yeah. There's also a lot of lift required to do it. I mean, we could probably do a whole episode on just kind of attempts that were missing some combination of moderation and juice,
Yeah.
very smart, well-intended kind of artist-owned, artist-driven efforts that don't get off the ground. There's so many of them because a lot of people do try. with varying levels of capitalization or lack thereof. But then also there's just kind of the juice problem. Like this goes from local to global efforts of this nature, right? Like you either have to have really good moderation so that it doesn't go off the rails and
Yeah.
like become spammy, or have scammers around it, because then people don't want to go.
Yeah.
Or if there's just not enough juice, period, and there's not enough to get people in there, then they're not going to go there, because it still has to be some sort of a destination, right? So there's a lot that I've even put off doing at Rhythm Changes because I know that I don't have the juice, and like I don't have the resources to force it either, like either by moderation or by trying to drive a lot of traffic to it. Like I can't go into I don't have a Rhythm Changes Discord server because I know I can't fuel it, like it
Right.
demands something. It's not a set and forget thing. It takes both effort and
Yeah.
some kind of intangible juice.
It would be a lot of work. I was just going to say, have you ever thought about a Rhythm Changes Discord? I could see that being really rad in our scene, right? Like a space where people would obviously just talk about gigs that are coming up, and it'd be like a small group of people who are just enthusiastic about the blog and enthusiastic about the scene. But yeah, I totally hear you. Like the overhead on that, and that's obviously the appeal of the platforms, and they know that they actually kind of handle infrastructure, moderation. It just comes at the expense of some stuff that you would otherwise really hope for, right? Easy community, unfiltered and unmoderated access to each other, able to send something in a group chat and everyone sees it. Everyone who is interested can see it, instead of a roll of the dice.
Instead of what you call the IG panopticon, which is this weird emergent behavior where people post stuff that, like, if it's your friend and you look at what they're posting, you could say it's cringe or it doesn't make sense, because, like, what are they doing this for? Like,
Yeah.
they're posting something that's very kind of processed, right? That it
Yeah.
doesn't make sense as an expression of themselves. But what I got from your piece is that it's just your assessment that they're doing this because of these pressures that we've all felt, and they feel that they have to, just to try and reach people, even if they don't know that they're reaching anyone. They have to behave as if they're talking to everyone at once, and that's like getting worse and worse and worse the more we go into short form video land, where it's like a gambling behavior that you talk about, and you have to try and talk like that every time, because the only way you can, like, get yourself to do it is if you treat each attempt as like a shot at reaching some mythical viral audience, right?
Yeah, that's exactly the effect I was writing about. And like, I'm sure anyone listening to this can think of an example where they have like one friend or person they follow that you are like, the way you're talking or the amount that you're posting is incongruous with the actual following that you have, right? Like, there's maybe 15 people that like really, really are into and care what you're up to. You are posting as if this is about to all blow up. And it really did make me think of for anyone who's not familiar, like the Foucault's idea of the panopticon, which he took from a much earlier, I think, social scientist. Basically like this idea of a prison where if you can see from a guard tower in the center of a round prison into every one of the cells, you actually don't need there to be a guard in that tower all the time, because everyone will just behave as if they're being watched all the time, right? That's the idea of the panopticon, which I believe the original iteration was meant to be like a suggestion for how to build prisons. Foucault was more saying that's pretty messed up, and we should be careful about structuring society like that. But it really is that effect, right, where people, because you don't know what's going to happen, and because the goal is just like this infinite growth of follower base or whatever, that you have to kind of just, that was the pressure I was feeling, right? It's, I'm making a bad song in Ableton on my laptop after work. And I'm somehow thinking about an imagined audience of people who are going to check it out. In my case, there is no audience, right? Like I'm not a music producer who people are like following to check out what I do. I have friends who I could send it to, but really the fact that was getting in the way of my just enjoying myself making music is patently silly.
Yeah. And one of your prescriptions at the end that is accessible is that, it's the worthwhile thing is to try and avoid the expectations and find your own ways to go about it. Like I was going to say for you, yeah, you have friends who are into it and you gather those people at your own home when you put out your record and
Right.
spun the record and had a great time, and that you shared your music with a bunch of people that way. And, that's an example of something that a lot of different creatives can do, that, if you pursue that and if you hold that out as something that you're looking forward to instead of something that you're kind of playing this slot machine towards, that this makes more sense for so many people. I think that's a big, not only is that a big theme, but I mean, in the time since we published a piece together, like you've done this a few times, even since then, you've lived it out. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. And it's, I think having written this makes me think hard about each new thing that I want to try. I think sometimes I've like shackled myself also, where sometimes I want to just like make a song and maybe like stop myself from posting too much about it or something, because I'm like, well, I don't want to be hypocritical here. And certainly I think some of the response to the piece was people saying, I would quit Instagram, but whatever, I still need to like promote my gigs. And that's like not what the piece was about, right? Like I don't care that people are promoting their gigs on their Instagram, and nor do I say that like, oh, you should quit all this stuff. It's more just about the like, let's be realistic about like what's on offer here, right? Like you're a customer of the platform. If you're an artist, you are asking, Meta for something, which is eyeballs. You're a customer of theirs in the same way that their advertisers are customer. And if you're not paying them, like, say maybe Rhythm Changes or some of your bosses would pay Meta, then you're just like a second class customer, and they're not going to be a very good supplier of eyeballs to your content. So my ask was people get like clear eyed about like what's really on offer there. And in some cases that's still worth it for some folks. But I think I also encourage people to like, go smaller. Think about, making community, and how that, can feel a lot better than throwing Instagram reels into the void every couple of days, trying to hit it big.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny because there's a part where you talk about, imagine a video. This is what you said. Imagine you post video of yourself playing and it goes supernova. And then you talk about numbers, tens of thousands of likes or whatnot. Sure. And then you kind of say, well, what happens next? And it's funny because even though it's rare, it's on top of it being rare, for the people who do actually hit all sevens on the slot machine, it doesn't necessarily lead to any immediate financial or real life return. It can, start to build an audience, but then there's going to have to be a lot of subsequent effort to keep doing the thing with it. And a lot of that effort is going to be in the real world as well. So it's like, It's not, you don't just kind of make it when you win this game temporarily. It's a very fleeting thing.
Yeah.
And that's becoming more and more that way. So even for the people who do, there is a particular artist here in Vancouver who I'm thinking of right now. I'll send it to you after, who had an experience like this. Well, I don't think we need to necessarily examine her video because it doesn't really change what we're talking about here, but like it's changed, her metrics on her account, but it hasn't, as far as I know, it hasn't changed anything tangibly in her career yet. And it could, there's something there that you can build on, but you have to build upon it. It's not like you get it and then you're done. You have to keep doing what you were doing. And it's almost like it's more of a beginning than an end or a culmination.
It makes me think of the claw machine, when you get hitting the all sevens is just getting the thing in the claw, getting the if they got an iPhone or a particularly large stuffy, and the amount of work it takes to get from like picking up the thing that you want to actually getting it out of the claw machine into the prize box is almost impossible, right? Like you kind of caught that. It is not tangible yet. And you don't own the audience, right? So like you're not even really steering the claw machine anymore. So like we were just talking about, someone who experiences that, it's amazing, but so much still has to go right and your work isn't done. You still have to either get lucky over and over and over again, or maneuver expertly to convert some of that audience into something that's like actually sustainable. People who will come to your shows and, check out every new release on streaming services, that kind of like 1,000 true fans kind of concept, right? And to get from kind of an immaterial victory, like hitting big on a social media platform, to like something material, like building a true audience of fans. I feel like that chasm is like enormous, and huge props to anyone who figures it out. But I think some younger artists, as they see it happen, it seems like, well, after the first big success, it just comes together, and that's cannot really be the case.
Yeah, and it has to be a real fit between what you did to catch those people's attention and what you go on to do. And if you try and mess with that too much, then you pull the plug, sort of. Like, I mean,
Yep.
for example, it's not something that I worry about too much. I kind of just try to do this anyway, and I am aware that it is not going to be extremely effective, but I just do it occasionally anyways. It's like the audience that I have at Rhythm Changes is not particularly interested in hearing me play.
Right.
Like, I promote my own performances in the crevices of Rhythm Changes, but it is not very effective at getting people out, because that's not why they showed up there. They don't really care if I'm playing or what I'm up to as a musician. Maybe some percentage of them will, but it's probably an equal or lower percentage of just other people that I would encounter in my musical life, because they came to me for something that isn't that.
Mm-hmm.
And if you have a viral moment, it's extremely likely that it will be for something that isn't your thing. And so then
yes.
there's a thing there that you have to reckon with.
I'm sure you've seen accounts where they get, I more see it on like comedy accounts or whatever, where they will get one very successful video and then the whole account pivots to like just riffing on the one successful thing. Sometimes to great effect, because I think that works particularly well for TikTok, where the TikTok algorithm is very sophisticated and can be pretty good at going like, this type of thing worked once and we're going to like keep on feeding that to people. I always find it a bit of a bummer when I see someone who is like creative and trying a bunch of stuff out and one thing hits and they go, that's it forever. It's this like same format, same joke, the same time every time. I think that's maybe not a way to structure an artistic life.
Yeah.
And maybe someone should focus on making a bunch of small bets, which brings us to our next our next topic here.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll throw you on that. And there's another kind of thing that's coming into my mind right now. I actually think we should table this and we should pursue this in full, because maybe you haven't even seen this yet, or I'll show this to you. But there is a certain creator who is local, who has really found something interesting, and he's talking about this in a meta way with what he's creating too. He's actually started like a printed publication.
Oh.
Have you seen this that he's mailing? I'll show this to you later. We can talk about this in its own separate thing. But there's a really interesting example of somebody right now who has like found himself in a white hot, core of what we're talking about here. And there's a lot more in the piece. So I'll leave it there in terms of your piece, Big Things Coming. I think it's still very much like you could have put it out now, like it's a reflection of where things have been, and artists can find themselves in it because you came to those thoughts by talking with a lot of the people that we spend our time with. We have our own little versions of it, but this is something about like the artist experience that's out there that we've noticed, and I appreciated the way that you put it all together. So yeah, that's the Big Things Coming discussion at the moment. And you have something else that you wanted to bring in now as kind of the part 2 of our double header. So I will throw it to you for that.
Sweet. Yeah. From, my article, Big Things Coming, to an article, Will writes many articles, of course. But this one, I think, turned into even a little more, where an article Will wrote got him featured on a podcast that was relevant to the article he wrote. And it kind of unlocked this whole area of culture and thinking about music scenes and urban planning, of all things, that I knew nothing about. So I'm interested to talk about this. The article on Rhythm Change is called "Strong Towns Music, Strong Music Scenes," where Will has kind of remixed Chuck Marone's ideas in the podcast Strong Towns. Is Strong Towns like a blog and podcast? Is that?
Yeah, funny those things that are both blogs and podcasts, right? It's a nonprofit that advocates for a nonpartisan type of urban affairs related stuff that is probably a little too big to sum up, that you can kind of browse around and see. But I think just the thing to know about Strong Towns in broad strokes is they're definitely not like in the American political system.
Yeah.
They're not a product of the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. And the things they talk about, in my opinion, are very poorly served by both parties. So that's probably why they exist as a nonprofit. And the author is a former engineer who has written a bunch of books about what he sees as important issues in 20th to 21st century urban affairs, transportation affairs, and things like that. So it's not music related, but that's why I kind of took the ideas and brought them into my life.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And like after I read this, when did this come out? 2021. And you probably talked to Chuck right close after that, like winter 2022.
Yeah. You know how it happened was like they just reached out to me. You know, and it's the same way that I would reach out to somebody to have them on the Rhythm Changes podcast in my tenure. But this is kind of on the more personal side too, right?
Like if I
think about when I wrote this, what's that?
You didn't send the article to Chuck?
I did not send the article to him. Now, this was early on in my time of doing this, but I still do this. I still often I write things, and when I'm writing them, I'm sending out flares to that person. You know, there's an intent to it. So. Yeah. Yes, I had that intent. Back then, I didn't have that many reps of doing this. You know, I still do this today. I did it recently in Subscriber Fridays at Rhythm Changes. I reacted to somebody's article in the Georgia Straight because I kind of wanted them to read it. And, you know, I look forward to that conversation when it happens. But, you know, if I think back to when I was digging these ideas in the original piece on Rhythm Changes where I remixed their words. I talk about that when I got on the Strong Towns podcast with Chuck. But no, I didn't know Chuck. We'd never spoken. Wow. I had been a Strong Towns consumer and member at times as well for a few years.
Yeah.
Going back to when I kind of did my solo trip to Copenhagen in my early 20s. But I had very little going on at this time in late 2021. I was in trouble. Like I was working my way out of the darkest parts of COVID.
Right.
Like I was in a bad place work-wise. I was in a bad place personally. Yeah. I was about to quit drinking. I was in a bad place. And so this was really like something that, you know, I enjoyed digging into when I had a lot of time to do things like that. And the fact that, you know, they ended up picking it up and I got to have that conversation with him, it was really nice. And it really, the timing of it was really funny. And I'll make this quick in case it overlaps with something else that you were just about to say. But like, when you listen to the podcast episode, like we don't talk about the gig list at all at Rhythm Changes. And there's a reason why. It's because it didn't exist yet. It's because we talked in March of 2022 and the gig list was launched on May 1st.
Wow.
So my entire conception of Rhythm Changes at that point, it did not include the gig list.
Yeah.
So that's a very bizarre artifact of when he talked to me. But it also speaks to the fact that I was on the cusp of like seasons kind of turning around personally at the time, and being there, it was the beginning of like a period of time where things started getting a little bit better. So I remember it very, very fondly for that.
Yeah, this is I've just seen the date now. This came out like days before you got sober, right? Or before you wow.
Yeah, because that was on December 25th of Christmas 2021. Right up there.
The 21st. So like actual days. Which, I mean, congrats. And that's cool kind of changing of the seasons for this to happen and then them to reach out to you. That's very cool. To zoom out a bit on Strong Towns in general, I would love to hear you explain either the philosophy or the ethos as you understand it, as it like pertains generally maybe to urban planning, urban design, because that's maybe something I'm still a bit foggy on reading your piece and listening to a bit of or listening to the podcast. But how would you explain the general ethos of Strong Towns?
I will, yes. So Chuck, as an engineer, one of his books is about how when he worked as a professional engineer in the civil area, he would end up working on these projects that were untethered to local communities. Like the classic examples, even through history, that are older than him, of like ramming a highway through a community. You know, that was written about famously by the author Jane Jacobs in New York City when, you know, there was an attempt at building a highway through Greenwich Village. The city we live in, Vancouver, does not have a highway running through its city center because, in no small part due to this school of thought, many other cities do. And there's a theme around Strong Towns that relates to financial and technical decisions that are to the detriment of actual local life and community. And on the financial side, it's that the suburban development pattern is what Chuck and Strong Towns call a growth Ponzi scheme, which is a provocative way to put it. And they intend to say that in actual dollar terms, where they believe that suburban development cannot pay for itself in the long term because you will literally not collect enough property taxes for the long-term maintenance of those subdivisions. In terms of like, because they're remote from the city, they need roads and utilities and repairs and etc. And like, if you literally tally that up, it's hard to actually make it math out where you can pay for the things over the long term. And so according to Strong Towns, the reason why you could call it a growth Ponzi scheme is because the more of that you build, the more liabilities you create for your city in the future, and the harder it is to pay off. Whereas historic city, what they call the traditional development pattern, because it's denser. Ultimately, this is like a density question. If you just look at like, well, how much like tax revenue are you getting per acre? Like, it's vastly more in the dense core of a city because there's more people and there's more commercial activity and spread out, you know, not spread out as much, not covering as much land and not requiring as much physical service and infrastructure. And so the financial thesis of Strong Towns, as I understand it, is just like, the more suburban development has unfolded, the more we have created all these liabilities that we don't properly account for, and that eventually, you know, they conceive of it as a ticking time bomb that is similar to how some people conceive of climate change. You know, you can debate to what extent either of those things are true, but they basically talk about how that is a very significant looming threat of cities. That's the financial side of it. And then there's a cultural dimension of it too that they talk about, where, you know, just activities in people's lives have changed and people have become more isolated. And there's kind of this whole sociology of this that has been written about in different ways and that we talk about in the context of like local music scenes. That's where my interest to rewrite the ideas in the context of local music scenes came from, is because it's not just about the numbers. It's about, as the sprawl lifestyle has come about over these past several decades, like, what has that meant for the social dimensions of people's lives? So I would say that Strong Towns advocates for the traditional development pattern as we would imagine it today to be pro-social and financially sustainable. And you can see why like neither political party in America is any good at this at all, right? They don't talk about that.
Every party has their NIMBYs and their kind of anti-urbanist. So would you say that like the Strong Towns ethos kind of falls into like maybe what a new urbanism mode, or is it more, I don't want to say regressive, but like, you know, if I think of new urbanism, I think of like the Not Just Bikes YouTube channel. I think he's in the Netherlands. He's from like Mississauga or something, and moved to the Netherlands and found, if you're not just making a city full of stroads, that life's actually pretty good. And is that kind of the Strong Towns angle, or am I miscategorizing?
This is a hyper personalized translation of this for you. They are closely related. I would describe like, okay, if Not Just Bikes is like Money for Nothing, Strong Towns is me. You know, like we're on the same continuum, but there's a different positioning there. And Strong Towns also doesn't neatly fit onto NIMBY or anti-NIMBY. I think they're definitely more anti-NIMBY, but it's not all about full bore development. It's about incrementalism and other things like that, more so than, you know, super pro development housing policy per se. Yeah, even though I think a lot of those people are behind the like there's overlap there between like the Not Just Bikes thing and then like the super pro development and like the anti NIMBY people and the Strong Towns. There's a lot of overlap there, but yeah, they're triangulated a little bit.
Yeah, I guess like there isn't necessarily a binary between like NIMBYism and pro kind of pro community, pro traditional development, because the anti-NIMBYs or the YIMBYs or whatever, the S in my backyard pro development is also not exactly what Chuck's talking about, right? We're not talking about like tearing down existing things to build huge sky rises, which is what you result in parts of Vancouver sometimes, where communities are disrupted or moved for development, not just for urban sprawl. So that's really interesting to apply that kind of thinking to music scenes, which is kind of what you did in the article and then in your conversation with Chuck, which I loved, by the way. The podcast what you guys did together is amazing, partially because I love how much he just wants to talk about music with you. Like it's music, it's so good. Most of the podcasts, and I recommend all listeners check it out, is Chuck talking about music and kind of the creative life, which is so interesting that's how he thinks about what he does too, right? In terms of creativity, talk about his giving talks as a performance. How do you think, so if say suburban sprawl is maybe the problem to solve with the Strong Towns ethos as far as urban planning goes, what's like the sprawl equivalent in the music scene? Like what do you see being antithetical to the strong scenes thing that you're writing about?
I love it because this is where I can start shaking on the spice, and it's like I only just got there at the end of the podcast episode. It's a very simple answer in my opinion: grants.
Okay.
And it's, in Canada we can definitely focus on just calling it grants.
Yeah.
But in the US there's there are grants, but they come from different places.
Yeah.
And in different volumes and at different times and in response to different things. But I think from a perspective of two Canadians here, we can call it grants. And I have a lot to say on that, and I kind of just touched on it at the end.
Yeah,
it's funny because he set it up, and I didn't quite get the chance to reply fulsomely to it. But Chuck was talking at the end of our episode about like, oh, there's this big new theater that we built in our community or something, and he was like, well, did we do the wrong thing here or
right?
And I'm like, well, kind of. I mean, if you want to be fully principled, maybe, but he was talking about the nice concerts they've had because of it. But it's like ultimately not just how was it started, because obviously you need like a big chunk of private money to spin up something like that. Nobody builds like big capital architectural projects like that anymore without a public private partnership, especially in this country we live in. But it's not just about, to me, when I put the spotlight on grants in this view I have, it's not just about what you need to get something off the ground, because I can empathize with that in probably the majority of cases. And like I've written a couple of factor artist development grants for myself. I've helped my friends get some kind of grants, but no, I'm talking about ongoing operations. Right. What is required on an ongoing basis to finance such a thing? Like a cultural endeavor, to what extent does it pay for itself? To what extent does it require regular operational support? And that's baked into the model, and it will always need that. And then if it doesn't get that, it is threatened. Well, there's going to be some kinds of art and some kinds of music that do require that more than others.
Yes.
There's going to be some that don't really require it because it's like popular music or popular art or things like that. But then there's going to be other things that do. But like, to what extent, and what are our priorities around that, and how much are we really laying out to support that? So there's something there where it's like there are things in the industry that would never exist without this kind of thick layer of public
Sure.
funding. And that's the sprawl equivalent
Yeah.
in my mind, I guess. And those are a lot of my personal bugaboos, that I've experienced in the
Yeah.
industry. But they're also like, there are real people I know who like work in this industry. So there's a human face on it as well. So I
Yeah.
never just like to poo it all the time. But like, I have the bias of, I've shown up at the table with like
Yeah.
fiscal conservative values. And so obviously I'm biased against a lot of all that other stuff, but it's been interesting to actually meet the humans who are doing it. And then that adds nuance to it as well. It brings me back to like that thing I shared you about Factor, where it's like Canadian rock bands that
Right.
get like $500,000 in career earnings from Factor. Like there's a perfect example. There's an easy
Sure.
target, right?
Yeah.
It's like,
Yeah. Exactly.
why like this is popular music, like what are we doing here? Like
Right.
either if you still want to spend that money on the arts, there are other genres of music that
That
are
need-
non-commercial that might actually require it instead of something like that. It's very, very strange. So when I think about what is the sprawl equivalent, absolutely I think about grants.
So yeah, where if suburban development will never make it back, or it's unsustainable, it's over mortgaged, they're never going to collect all the property tax necessary to develop the infrastructure to do that. There are these arts projects that are funded by grants that will never kind of feed into the local economy of the music scene economy, if you want to call it that. And we're not talking just specifically about like a local urban economy, but that is a factor. I hate to say factor when we're talking about grants, but like, it is a factor. So yeah, I think that makes sense as a framing. I am undecided in that and how I feel about that. I mean, I think many artists would say the example we're talking about is. Do you remember the artist's name or the author's name of that article?
Yeah, the author's name is Paul Lawton, and he wrote an article in the early 2010s where he identified like top career earnings from Factor Awards, of Canadian pop rock bands or whatever, and some of them had just earned hundreds of thousands of dollars by like staying in Toronto and working the Factor ecosystem and getting subsidized, right?
Yeah, I think the example was like the Trues made like $500,000 on
like Metric, or the Trues,
and it was I think based on he was doing the math on like how far they live from from downtown Toronto, which is very funny. And I think many artists would be aligned that like that's not a great use of that money, right? Like of grant funding, and that money isn't going into things that are going to sustain a scene, right? You talk about import, what do they call that? Import replacement. Where say like I can think of an example in my hometown. I think it's because some radio station won a contest, but the Trues, the actual Trues, came to Smithers and played this big, I'm sure very expensive concert for like, I don't know, probably 1,500, 2,000 people. And like, that didn't contribute to the economic development of the music scene in Smithers, right? People went to come see the Trues, and then they were gone. And a bunch of money was spent that didn't really foster anything in the scene, right? No venue really benefited there. No local act got to open and get exposure, right? It just...
That is a tragedy, man.
Yeah, well, the Trues were the opener actually, because it was Sam Roberts' band was that was the prize. I remember what happened now.
There's another one.
A local radio station. Yeah, sure. Sam Roberts' band was on that list. A local radio station won a contest, like a national, some sort of, music radio station contest. And so Sam Roberts' band and the Trues came to play in Smithers. But I think that's a great example of something that you write about in the article. And you kind of talked about with Chuck, where these are things that don't feed into the scene. And maybe it would have been better. Maybe a good prize would be to like, here is 10 grand to pay 3 local bands, put on a lights show, rent a venue, and like, give free tickets to everyone in Smithers so they can come see it and have a great time, and then want to see those bands next week when they're playing the local bar.
Yeah. I mean, the import replacement thing, that's funny. That's more relevant today than it was 4 years ago when I wrote it, for the
Yeah.
reasons of the current landscape, for sure. That comes up when people say things like, "Oh, everybody spends all their money on the Taylor Swift shows, and then they don't have any money left over to spend on the local shows," or
Right.
uh, they overlook the local things. When I wrote my response to the article in the Straight, I think I that was a critique that they made in that article too.
Right.
That's something that you hear people talk about, and so there's definitely something there of like, well, it is worth working hard to try and get the local things in front of people so that they will divert more dollars to that. If you assume that they have a fixed budget, then unfortunately you gotta compete for something like that. Not every I try to think of everything as positive some whenever I can, but sometimes that's just how the cookie crumbles, right? Like sometimes people do spend all their money on a big show, and then they don't have the mental or financial bandwidth to go much further than that. But it's really about, I think it's like something that I included in that original article, maybe just above. It's like the question of flows versus stocks,
Right.
capital flows versus capital stocks, where here I got it in front of me as well. I think this is something that I paraphrased directly from the Strong Towns piece, where they say, when money flows into a community and then quickly back out again, it's the economic equivalent of eating junk food. The empty calories may give a small sugar rush, but do little to build a healthy body. Plus, who is going to stick around when the going gets tough? So that's a question of like pumping money through a community as opposed to what is the retention. And so much retention has to be local, because when globalists move money around, it's less likely to be retained in certain ways. So the flows versus stocks thing is kind of
Mm.
right on that. And that's why when I talk about grants, I'm thinking about operationally. It's like on an ongoing basis. I mean, if you get real and you look at the dollars, if something requires public funding operationally year on year all the time, that means that means that in our country, Canadian taxpayers are literally shelling out on an ongoing basis X dollars every year to keep that thing operational.
Right.
What is the effect of that versus if those people had the money? Is
Yeah.
it To what extent is it better or worse? Because if they have the money, they could spend it on anything, right?
Right.
And that's the whole thing about free markets, really. But like,
Yeah.
if you're going to have some kind of public arts policy, you are deciding that you are appropriating that money from people because you think, oh, we're going to get a better outcome if we spend it here. How many grants are actually achieving that? What is the actual
Right.
directive and goal? There's even, you don't have to want to say there should be no grants to
Yeah.
look at that and be like, well, we got a long way to go here before we could consider that all that money is actually doing what we want it to do.
And I guess to like spin that to the positive, right? Like with the positive counterexample being maybe if something gets a grant to get started and then manages to figure out a way to make itself sustainable, then in theory, the scene benefits from that, right? That's a venue who can afford to like put on more shows, pay their artists more, um, and that like prosperity begets prosperity thing. Is that kind of like, does that fit into the ethos of the strong scene? Is that kind of how you think about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think Creative BC has a lot of good things that it does, because I think they're pretty transparent that the goal of their programs is to put people to work in BC.
Yeah.
And, if you want to be a successful applicant, in my opinion, the primary question is like, well, how many people are you putting to work in BC and to what extent? And so there's different ways you could spend the money that could have different effect. But it's a very explicit goal of stimulating what is really a local music scene centered around the Lower Mainland. Although, of course,
Yeah.
it's aspirationally for the whole province. But
Right.
I think if it funds people across the whole province, a lot of their activities probably end up getting tied to Vancouver at some point too.
Right.
And hey, if it lets them do their thing up in other cities around the province, then that probably does get retained pretty well
Yeah.
in that community. So yeah, you're subsidizing various things, and like, yeah, in my personal bias world, you want as few of those kind of subsidies as possible, but at least they're transparent, and at
Yeah.
least they are provincial in scope. I think it's really hard to do nationally. There's so many different interests and considerations to do. So it's an unenviable job to have to allocate that capital even after it's already been appropriated for that purpose.
Yeah. It's interesting to think about. So, like, say absent a grant, what's the like? Can you summarize the vision of a strong scene, either in our local scene or provincially or something? I think we can talk about Vancouver. I think is our focus, but how would you summarize that?
I think I would look back to Big Things Coming, and I would think about what ends up being the artist's expectation or intention of what they're going to do.
Right.
Like, I think if you miss the forest for the trees, the first thing that you orient towards is like, well, how am I going to get a lot of streams or a lot of attention or win an award or get a lot of press
Yeah.
or even like put together a tour, because the tour then becomes such a gnarly project that is very likely to lose money if you're
Yeah.
not super careful, in and of itself. And like, that's a whole other thing. But how does the artist get that expectation? Why is it so easy for me when I put out my first album in 2020 as a leader to hire a publicist? Now, I didn't actually have a grant for that album, but
Right.
for many people, I think they add such a person or service to their project because they are paying for it with other people's money, i.e. a grant, right?
Right.
So because it's a thing to do, and like, artists do things because they're the thing to do all the time, and it's the water that they swim in, and we do things on social media because we think it's the thing to do as well. And that's so much of what we talked about with Big Things Coming. So the expectations get sucked away into all these places where the structures of them, they don't care about how much of it gets retained where you are.
Yeah.
And that's tough, because it's ultimately, if you drill down, it ends up being at your intentions as an artist. And who are you to criticize another artist's intentions? There's the systematic reasons of why they ended up wanting to do that.
Yeah.
But if what we both seem to wish for when we talk about these kinds of things is, well, how can we enter with expectations that are more aligned with what our lives are actually like, instead of just doing the things that we think we need to do? There's so much of that as a theme amongst all this stuff. And so for me, that's honestly a big reason why I put more effort into rhythm changes than all my music, because that's where I can feel like I'm actually doing it.
Yeah.
Like when I'm trying to, okay, the most generous way I could talk about what I'm doing in this respect is like, I'm trying to run rhythm changes optimized for how many people do I chat with and have fun conversations with because they recognize me or because I've done something to them, and like, how many musicians do I meet because I've covered them or because I've gained interest in them through the gig list. How many people actually end up going out to things because they saw it there? I try to optimize for the in real life stuff more than anything else. But if I just started doing it because I wanted to do a music blog and I wanted to do the way it was always done, I would be writing about the stuff that I thought would get me the most clicks and get me the most followers, and that would be the most efficient, in terms of growing an audience and converting it to subscribers even, or whatever. But if I got that same kind of generic basket of intentions, I'm occupied there, and maybe I'm not seeing the forest for the trees in terms of what I could do, in my backyard, so to speak, with the Strong Towns school of thought. So it's vague, and I feel like I was too vague when I talked about it with Chuck as well. But there's something there about the original intent and the systemic stuff that ended up that led you to have that intent in the first place.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, how can I open my mind up and see it a little bit more realistically, and see the people who are around me a little bit more. That's what I was reaching for back then, and hopefully I have been able to demonstrate that a little bit at Rhythm Changes. I don't have that much experience doing it myself as an artist even
Yeah.
at this point, but that's what I'm reaching for, right?
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think that helps me also kind of grasp that. I was going to say, one of my other questions for you was like, do you have in the interim, I think Rhythm Changes is a really good example of this ethos. Can you think of other examples in terms of like either music businesses in town, venues, promoters who are exemplifying the ethos in ways that you would say, even in like kind of a microcosm of, you know, maybe a venue and a promoter and a scene around that you see as a positive example of this?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to shout out Green Auto, even though it's not a place that I'm often spotted at, but I think you got to go there. I mean, it's funny. I was having a conversation earlier this week about there are some less desirable things about how Green Auto is prominent, and some of the more extremely informal DIY venues of the past were
Yeah.
very charming and, you know, very conducive to people getting to know each other, and that
Yeah.
we, you know, even though we talk about how great things are now versus the 2010s, you know, maybe we still don't have that one yet. Like we don't have quite as many vibrant super underground spaces, but
Right.
I think just the fact that you have that conversation at all, it speaks to how successful Green Auto is and how established it has become as like the go-to kind of DIY rock, etc. venue, and how people consistently come out to it, and it's able to, it's the Frankies of the indie pop and
Yeah.
rock world that's out there. And, you know, even though I'm not there all the time, so I don't have my finger on the pulse of it, I can absolutely see it for what it is, as like a huge gift that has emerged in the right kind of space where it's able to do that, and that
Yeah.
it can keep chugging along. You know, I'm super impressed by Green Auto. We don't have a Green Auto in the jazz scene.
Yeah.
Frankie's is way more stiff than a Green Auto, right? So,
Yeah.
you know, if it's Green Auto's like if Tyrant was like semi outdoors and 3 times the size, you know, like it's
Yeah.
wonderful.
It brings to mind like maybe like Merge. You
Yeah.
know, I'm just sure Merge doesn't do as well as Green Auto, or didn't do as well as Green Auto, or if it would still be around. There were, you know, other places that I'm thinking of. Is it Merge or Verge? Am I nuts?
Merge was a very small, yeah, kind of space where you'd hear like experimental
Yeah.
jazz people
Yeah.
back in the
I
day. I mean, I think 333 was the
Yeah.
example of like, oh, we missed this
I miss
kind of
I
thing. Green Auto doesn't feel the same as that, right? Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure it doesn't. Yeah.
333 was very DIY to the point that it could turn people off. I actually have not yet been to Green Auto myself, which maybe outs me as an old person. But yeah, I think that's right. I think it's like that sense of scale where some, you know, a venue or a scene is being realistic, but also it's like prosperous, where, you know, these shows are like really well attended. There's a scene and there's a buzz around them. They're smaller scale so that they are sustainable, right? Like I don't think Green Auto's at risk of like going bankrupt. They're probably at risk of like the building that they do things in being sold or whatever. I'm not sure what the state of the venue is there, but not in the same way that if, you know, you and I just like opened a venue on a grant or something, that we'd be at risk for just like not making rent the next month or something if we were just putting on jazz shows ourselves. But yeah, that's a very, very good example.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to talk out of school here, but like if you compare Green Auto to something like Redgate,
Sure.
you know, like Redgate has also had quite a run, and it's a known venue, but I think Green Auto is kind of eating Redgate's lunch on several different levels here, and there are existential risks that these types of venues have to dodge and are lucky to survive. So I mean, I guess it's good that they're, you know, that they've both done as much as they've done, even though they're having different rides on that trajectory right now.
Yeah. To pivot maybe as we kind of round out the strong scenes approach and ethos. What's an example of a little bet? You and Chuck talk about little bets, or is it small bets, little bets? Am I misphrasing?
Yeah. Yeah, what's an example? I mean, there are things that
In
I've
the
done
music scene, I
too,
mean, yeah.
but if we talk about locally, I think you have to go to Infidels Jazz because the story of Infidels Jazz is very tied up with my story. I feel like I've seen the whole rise because I have.
Mm.
But, if you just look at what Tim does now, he can sell hundreds of seats to a venue that has a couple hundred seats. But he didn't start out doing that. He started out doing things that had 30 seats and a lot of things that had 30 seats, and he still does those kinds of things. So the project that was Infidels Jazz in the days when Rhythm Changes was just getting going and when he was starting to present shows, it was small in that respect.
Right.
There is a different way that somebody else could have tried to start an Infidels Jazz. They could have started with a vision of what he's doing now. That's like, oh, we need to get jazz into the Pearl and into his other the Fox, and we need to get jazz into the Pearl and the Fox. We need to get a grant to cover the marketing and administrative lift that is required to do that. So we're gonna start there, and we're gonna fund, we're gonna capitalize there to that goal from the beginning, and we're gonna continue to operate based on what we say we need to be able to do that. But that is not how he did it. He started out doing what he was able to do, and he built the reputation brick by brick, and he ended up in those spaces. And I'm beyond proud of him for that, and that's why I really enjoy being involved with what he does. I'm super biased, obviously, because I work with him a bit on some of that stuff, but he is able to run so much of it himself because he has the experience and the skills and the smarts to be able to do it, but also because he started it small.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's an example that came to mind for me as well. And it is very interesting to think about from December of 2021 to where the Vancouver jazz scene is now, how I think many of those have paid off, right? Like Tim's made a series of little bets, and you have certainly with Rhythm Changes and some things you've tried. I think maybe the Gig List internship to free you up to do some other stuff is an example of a bet that you made, and I imagine you'd say that would paid off.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this if you sum up small bets means that if you fail, you do not lose. Right. You don't go broke.
You've just tried something.
I just saw today that there would be so much more to this story, that it is not just a neat version of what we're talking about playing up, but like the Regina Folk Festival announced today that they're dissolving permanently.
Wow.
That they didn't present last year. They framed it as they're taking a year off, and we're going to be back, all systems go in 2025. And now today they announced that they're dissolving. I'm sure there's so much more behind that story. So I'm not trying to throw them under the bus. Sure. and say, I just thought of that because that's like an example of going bust. But like, you're doing small bets if you can go totally bust on something and you don't lose, and you're able to keep playing at full strength. Like, it doesn't knock the wind out of your sails.
Yeah.
Like for me, it's like there's no individual piece of content or podcast episode or article or interview or experience. There's no individual experience I could have at Rhythm Changes that would destroy Rhythm Changes.
Right.
Eventually I would just make my way on to the next thing. And, even if, God forbid, I did something that a lot of people really got mad at me about, it still probably wouldn't even crush Rhythm Changes, because this is a bunch of individuals who both read free and paid, right? So I'm not going to lose 100% of the individuals who support me for any kind of reasonable expectation of a thing. If Tim absolutely bombs a show, he's going to lose a lot of money if he paid that artist a lot. But Infidels Jazz is not going to get destroyed by that. He is probably going to have another show the next night, and he's going to keep rolling. So it's because it was designed that way.
Yeah. Do you think there's elements of, like, maybe I'm mischaracterizing here, elements of degrowth in the strong towns and strong scenes ethos, where it's like if degrowthers are talking about, like, rather than focusing on infinite growth, infinite returns, focus on like what's reasonable right now. And that means managing your expectations, going smaller. Is that kind of aligned? I know that degrowth is probably less focused on prosperity, which it sounds like the strong towns, maybe your strong scenes idea is focused on like building wealth together, where degrowthers might say, let's like not focus on wealth. Let's just like do things on a small scale. But is that aligned at all, or do you think about that differently?
I think degrowth is not something that I would ever want to identify with
Mm,
myself personally. But the thing is, if there are already a lot of commitments and they add up to something that's fiscally unsustainable, then at some point you have to ask the question. And at some point, austerity comes for you
yeah,
in certain situations, and you can't keep the game of musical chairs will end at some point. And so that does kind of come up.
right.
And the more things that have been designed as a series of small bets, the more things will survive.
Yeah,
And then it's true. The unfortunate side of that is like, we're a lot of our kind of festivals that I've played at with my former band, or festivals that we would go to, from the thing I just mentioned about Regina to like the
yeah,
Vancouver Island Music Festival to, various other festivals. These are large operations that exist in a certain structure. And if that structure gets threatened, then yeah, we end up in a world where there's fewer of those things, and that's really tough.
right.
Do you call that degrowth? I mean, I guess it depends on what the intent is of how you're gonna survive and
Yeah,
what you're gonna do next instead. But there's a lot of stuff in this environment that was designed with something else in mind, and what it might not hold. And that's what the strong towns people say about suburbia. It's like, when is the bill going to come due? Nobody knows. But
right.
I suppose I do largely agree with them that that is probably going to have a big bill that comes due. We don't even understand how to pay
Yeah,
for it yet. And that's, I think, unfortunately, that probably is kind of like it's a disinflationary or a deflationary thing for
sure.
sure, even if you don't call it degrowth. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I think maybe that's where I know that like I don't follow too closely like the degrowth movement. I think sometimes that's talking about literally scaling back existing things. But I think lots of what they're focused on is like, let's examine expectations, desires, and make those right sized and reasonable instead of this infinite growth thing, which can't always happen, right? And so hearing about kind of taking small bets instead of these huge unsustainable things, hearing about making arts organizations, think about making themselves sustainable and able to maintain themselves. I do hear a bit of that where it's like you don't want to be put into this position where you've completely lost your shirt as an organization if something goes wrong, and instead focus on like what's reasonable for the size of your scene. This goes back to the big things coming thing as well, right? Like, don't worry about reaching 30,000 people with your Instagram reel or whatever. Like, make some music and send it to like 10 of your friends. And if they really like it, they'll send it to 10 of theirs. And that's pretty cool, if 100 people hear it. That like expectation management in the face of like platforms and parts of the economy wanting to go infinite when, that is a pretty tall order.
Yeah. I mean, do I think that, I guess if I went full degrowth, which I don't think this is a real position that anybody holds, but like, do I think that Canada's jazz festivals, when they lose their TD title sponsorship, as multiple of them have, do I think they should be preemptively torn down and those people's time and effort and resources
Hmm.
reallocated to other things? No.
No.
Do I think that it's likely that some of them will go bust, and that because of the way they're structured, they either do the festival or they don't, and sometimes that means the end of an organization? Yes.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, yes. So things have to play out, and they have every right to continue doing it. And I will be very happy the longer that they can continue doing it, and that I can continue to enjoy it.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, people proactively wanting to dismantle this type of thing, it doesn't seem to happen. I think there's other sorts of structures that people do want to, dismantle or cut, or that's austerity, right? As
Right.
a strategy to try and survive. But we're not there on most of this stuff yet. But I mean, when I was getting into strong towns, I felt like I saw it coming, and it's that kind of thing where people like the impending stock market crash, or you
Sure.
predict 50 of the last 2 recessions or whatever. There's
Yeah.
maybe my tendency is to be kind of an alarmist about it, but I've been concerned about it for a while, and the stuff that I've done reflects my concern, because I haven't tried to go out there and have the same kind of intentions
Yeah.
like we were talking about. I ended up with sort of different expectations and wishes, and when the green autos and the infidels jazzes of the world, I identify a lot with them.
Yeah. I love that. Thank you for telling me about strong scenes and strong towns. It's such an interesting way of thinking about things.
Yeah, you bet. Such a funny time that I still haven't met him. I hope I get to meet him. When he comes to Vancouver next time he does, or even
Yeah.
Seattle or whatever. I'm gonna make sure I go and meet him, because there's another thing I did too, which was with our trio. You didn't play on this, but I wrote the tune called Chuck Strip Mall, and he didn't find me because of that tune.
Right.
We layered that on kind of
Yeah.
as part of
Oh, cool.
the podcast experience. But there's a Strong Towns podcast episode from it must be June of 2020,
Right.
that talks about strip malls, this like ultimate caricature of sprawl, right?
Right.
And so I just named one of my blues tunes after that, and I ended up like putting the tune out after the podcast episode and kind of tying it into the collab that I did with Strong Towns.
That's awesome.
Just as another little bit of fun. So, but it was 2022, things coming back online, the beginning of this era. It was really interesting timing.
Very cool. Yeah, I'm glad you got to do that, and hopefully, you get to meet him.
Yeah. I'll see if I can drag you along to whatever that ends up being. If it's
I'll learn about urban planning. It's interesting to me, although I'm less informed.
Yeah. Well, we didn't. I mean, this could be its own thing too. But did you catch that when I wrote about the Georgia Strait piece again? Like I referenced the Cultural Land Trust project. Is this something that we talked about before?
We have talked about the Cultural Land Trust. I haven't read your rebuttal of the Georgia Strait, or whatever your response to the Georgia Strait piece. Is that, I should check that now.
It's not super duper relevant the way that I just worked it in to that thing last week, but like the idea of the Cultural Land Trust is very relevant to this type of stuff that we're talking about. That's another advocacy project that is happening here in Vancouver and probably other places too. That is a different part of the Venn diagram with Strong Towns and YIMBY and all that other stuff, right? That we might have our own kind of takes on. So that's something probably to explore as well. Is what do we make of this culture?
Yeah.
I was just trying to remember if you introduced it to me, like if
I
you were
did,
aware of it and then you sent it to me,
because the first time I heard about it was on About Here, where a CBC journalist, or maybe a contractor who just like works for them sometimes, talked about the Cultural Land Trust, which, for listeners who are not familiar with this, in Vancouver, there's an idea. I don't know how serious it is. It sounds like maybe you've heard more about it since that original idea, where you'd basically be taking homes off the market and putting them into a trust, like an actual cultural trust, to kind of rent lock them or save them for like arts organizations and artists themselves, to kind of prevent the brain drain that happens as the Vancouver housing market gets so unaffordable, renting and housing. Is that like a fair summary of what they're after?
I think so. Yeah, and certainly the impetus for it was the view that the market forces are bearing down really hard on certain kinds of venues that have kind of an outsized importance socially and culturally in the scene versus what they could hope to accomplish in the free market, and so they deserve some kind of subsidy. And this would be one way that you could like lock in some spaces and have project that they could be around for longer.
Interesting. I suspect the strong towns would not that ethos would not tolerate that, because it's got to make the space sustainable.
Well, I don't know. I think that's a really good question. What would the Strong Towns movement think of something like the Cultural Land Trust? I don't know if I could really rule on that right now off the top of my head. I think there's some wiggle room there,
Oh,
depending on
interesting.
how people like Strong Towns Vancouver. I'm not actually that involved. I'm on their newsletter, like there's a small Strong Towns Vancouver kind of group or gathering. They meet sometimes at like VPL or
Yeah.
cafes or something like that. I would love to go there and ask them
Yeah.
what they think, because I bet you the Strong Towns Vancouver is quite a progressive chapter.
Sure.
And I think I would guess that the vast majority of them would be very, very into the Cultural Land Trust. I don't know if that would be the case for a lot of other Strong Towns chapters. Maybe it is. But yeah, no, I think that's a fascinating question. I don't really know.
Interesting. We might have to explore that as we talk about the idea. Yeah, the thing that comes to mind right now is like I remember the. I don't even think it's the original Redgate. I think it's the second Redgate, which was on Hastings. It was in Strathcona. It was at like Hastings and just a couple blocks west of Clark. And that got bought by like Chip Wilson's development group and turned into, I don't know, a soup restaurant or something. And I remember at the time being like, well, why can't anyone do anything about this? And of course, just houses get bought and venues get shut down all the time. So it's very interesting to think about an alternative where if that had been deemed, I don't think Redgate at that time would have been deemed like so culturally important that it had to be preserved. But like what happens to Green Auto, right? When that property, which is increasing in value a lot, I imagine they do not own the space. What happens to that when that gets, sold and developed, right? Like we love to see Green Auto, and it would be a shame if that goes away. So yeah, interesting to think about.
Yeah, that really does deserve its own treatment. So we gotta table that one too.
Yeah.
But this was a good doubleheader. They were related in some
Yeah.
interesting ways. We got more material coming out of it as well. So that's gonna be episode 2. I dig it. I'm looking forward to episode 3, keeping the weekly thing going. Are you going to make it out to any shows, this weekend or in the near future? I know you're back in town. You were out of town
Yeah.
for a little bit. So do you have anything on your radar in terms of what you're going to go to?
I'm going to go see Bruno Hubert on Sunday if I can
Right on.
make it in there. I imagine that will be a packed house. So yeah,
I hope
that's
so. I'm going to be there.
great. I'll see you there. That's my plan. Although I'm wide open on Saturday, so if something comes up, I might do that as well.
Nice.
What about yourself?
So that's probably when I'll see you next.
Great.
So that's fun.
Lost Dog, my new fave venue.
Talk about DIY spaces.
Yeah, I'd love to see it.